Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Ryan's hands trembled as he stared at the torn fabric hanging from the pine branch, 12 feet above the forest floor. The bright yellow of Hannah's hiking jacket fluttered in the October wind like a warning flag, shredded and stained with something dark that wasn't mud. Hannah. His voice cracked through the silence of Cascade National Forest, echoing off the towering Douglas firs that seemed to lean inward, pressing against the narrow trail. The fabric was fresh, no weathering, no fading. She'd been here recently, very recently, 48 hours. That's how long his 16-year-old daughter had been missing from the youth group camping trip. The rangers had called off the official search at sunset, citing dangerous terrain and incoming weather. But Ryan couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Not with winter storms rolling in and temperatures dropping toward freezing. He reached up, stretching until his fingertips brushed the torn material. The moment he touched it, a sound rolled through the forest. Low, guttural, like nothing he'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his boots. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt wrong. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even his own breathing seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ryan pulled out his phone to photograph the evidence, but the screen remained black despite multiple attempts to power on. The device had worked fine an hour ago at the trailhead. Now it was dead weight in his pocket, like everything else electronic he'd brought. He stuffed Hannah's jacket fragment into his backpack and pressed deeper into the woods, following what might have been a game trail. The path was barely visible, marked only by broken branches and disturbed undergrowth. Someone, or something, had passed this way recently, leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. The tracks were wrong, too large for human feet, with long grooves that could have been claws. But mixed among them were smaller prints that made his heart race. Hannah's hiking boots, the distinctive waffle pattern he'd helped her choose just 3 months ago. As the afternoon light faded, filtered green through the canopy, Ryan noticed the trees around him were different. Older, massive trunks scarred by decades of storms, their bark carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Deep gouges formed crude patterns, spirals, intersecting lines, shapes that hurt to look at directly. The temperature dropped suddenly, as if he'd walked into an invisible wall of cold air. His breath misted with each exhale, and frost began forming on the nearby branches despite the October warmth he'd left behind just minutes earlier. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Ryan's place? Another sound echoed through the forest, closer this time. Rhythmic, deliberate, like heavy footsteps, but with too many beats per stride. Ryan froze, straining to identify the direction, but the acoustics of the dense woods made localization impossible. Then he saw the blood. A trail of dark spots led away from the carved trees, disappearing into a grove where the canopy grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. The spots were fresh, still glistening. Hannah's blood. He was certain of it with the instinctive knowledge that only a parent could possess. Ryan followed the trail, his hiking boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed to move on their own, rustling and shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, carrying scents of decay and something else, something ancient and organic that made his stomach turn. The blood trail led to a clearing where the trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks twisted into unnatural spirals that defied everything he knew about how forests grew. In the center stood a structure that shouldn't exist, a framework of bones and branches woven together with what looked like human hair. Hanging from the structure were pieces of fabric, dozens of them in various stages of decay. Some recent, others so old they crumbled at the touch of wind. But at the base, arranged in a careful pattern, were Hannah's belongings. Her water bottle, her compass, her emergency whistle, and her backpack, slashed open, its contents scattered across the ground like an offering. Ryan's hands shook as he gathered his daughter's possessions, and that's when he felt it. The sensation of being watched by something vast and patient and utterly hostile. The forest had gone silent again, but now that silence felt predatory, like the held breath of a hunting cat. He turned slowly and saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs, reflecting what little light penetrated the canopy. They surrounded the clearing at various heights, some at ground level, others impossibly high in the trees, all focused on him with an intelligence that was alien and ancient and filled with territorial rage. A voice spoke from everywhere at once, not heard but felt, vibrating through his bones. "You do not belong here. This place is ours. She is ours now." Ryan's rational mind tried to process what was happening, to find logical explanations, but the primal part of his brain, the part that remembered when humans were prey, understood perfectly. He was being hunted by something that had claimed this territory long before any human had ever walked these mountains. But Hannah was here somewhere, close. He could feel it. "I want my daughter back," he said aloud, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. The response came as movement in the trees. Branches swayed without wind, shadows shifted without cause. And then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, he heard it, Hannah's voice, calling for help. Ryan ran toward the sound, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at his clothes and skin. The voice led him deeper into the maze of ancient trees, always just ahead, always just out of reach. Behind him, he could hear pursuit, something large moving through the forest with terrible purpose. The chase continued until full darkness fell, and Ryan realized with growing horror that he was no longer on any trail. The forest had become a labyrinth, and something was hurting him deeper into its heart, using his own daughter's voice as bait. When he finally stopped, exhausted and bleeding from a dozen scratches, he found himself in another clearing. This one was different, older, more sacred somehow. Stone monuments rose from the earth like broken teeth, and the air hummed with power that made his skin crawl. Hannah was there. She sat perfectly still against one of the stones, her eyes open but vacant, staring at nothing. Alive, but not present. Something had taken her mind, left only the shell behind as another offering to whatever claimed dominion over this cursed place. "Hannah!" Ryan rushed to her side, but when he touched her shoulder, she didn't respond. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. She was slipping away, becoming part of this place like all the others who had wandered too deep into territories that humans were never meant to enter. The Guardian emerged from the shadows then, not quite human, not quite animal, but something far older than both. It moved with the fluid grace of water and the inexorable power of stone, its form shifting in the darkness so that Ryan could never quite focus on what he was seeing. "She belongs to the forest now," it said without speaking. "As will you, if you do not leave before the moon reaches its peak." Ryan looked up through the canopy and saw Luna rising, already 3/4 visible. Maybe an hour before it reached its highest point. After that, according to the Guardian's promise, he would join Hannah in whatever twilight existence she now inhabited. But he was her father, and some bonds are stronger than ancient territorial claims. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The choice was impossible, but Ryan made it anyway. He would not leave without his daughter, even if it meant facing something that had defended these mountains since before his civilization existed. Love, he realized, could be just as primal and powerful as the ancient forces that ruled this haunted forest. In the end, some territories are worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds. The morning David found Samantha's backpack, it was hanging 12 feet up in an ancient Douglas fir, impaled on a branch that had grown through the fabric like a skeletal finger. The ranger station had told him search and rescue would resume at daybreak, but David hadn't slept. He'd driven the winding mountain roads in darkness, his truck's headlights cutting through fog that seemed to breathe around the towering pines of Olympic National Park. Samantha had been missing for 36 hours. His daughter, 22 years old, an experienced hiker who knew better than to venture off marked trails. The backpack swayed gently in the windless morning air, 20 feet from the nearest tree trunk, impossible to reach without climbing gear. David circled the massive fir, his breath forming clouds in the September cold, trying to understand how her pack had ended up there. The canvas was torn, not by accident or wear, but by something with claws, deep parallel gashes that spoke of deliberate violence. Dark stains had soaked through the fabric, stains that looked too much like dried blood. But it was what fell from the pack when David shook the tree trunk that made his stomach clench with primal fear. Teeth. Human teeth. 3 molars that clinked against the forest floor like dice. David's hands trembled as he picked them up, recognizing the small gap between the canines. The same gap Samantha had refused to let him fix with braces when she was 12. These weren't lost teeth. They'd been torn out. A sound drifted through the trees then, low and rhythmic like chanting in a language that predated words. David's head snapped up, following the sound deeper into the forest where the morning light failed to penetrate the canopy. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to drive back to town and wait for the professionals. But these were his daughter's teeth in his palm, her blood on her pack, and somewhere in this wilderness she might still be alive. The trail disappeared 50 yards into the old-growth forest, but David pressed on, guided by broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that formed a path too deliberate to be accidental. The trees here were enormous, their trunks wide enough to hide a truck, their bark scarred with symbols that looked carved but felt grown, as if the wood itself had twisted into patterns of concentric circles and angular lines that hurt to look at directly. The chanting grew louder. David's phone had lost signal an hour ago, the GPS spinning uselessly as if the satellites themselves couldn't find this place. His compass needle swung in lazy circles, unable to find magnetic north. The air tasted of copper and rotting meat, and with each step forward, the temperature dropped another degree. He found the first body at noon. It hung upside down from a massive cedar, arms spread wide and bound to the lower branches with what looked like sinew. The man had been dead for weeks, maybe months, his body perfectly preserved by the cold and something else David didn't want to think about. The corpse's mouth was open in a silent scream. Empty of teeth and carved into his forehead was the same angular symbol David had seen in the bark. A ranger's uniform hung in tatters from the desiccated frame. The name tag read, Torres. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in David's place? David stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root that felt too much like a finger. He landed hard, his hand sinking into earth that squelched with moisture that wasn't water. The ground beneath the hanging man was dark with old blood, and as David tried to stand, his fingers touched something buried in the soft soil. More teeth. Dozens of them yellowed with age, some still attached to fragments of jawbone. The chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, David heard his own ragged breathing, the frantic hammering of his heart, and underneath it all a sound like footsteps circling him just beyond the edge of sight. The footsteps didn't follow any human rhythm. They came in clusters of 3. Pause, then 3 more, as if whatever made them had too many legs or not enough. A branch cracked to his left. David spun toward the sound, but saw only shadows between the trees that seemed to move independently of the wind. The shadows were wrong, too dark, too solid, and they rippled like water when his eyes focused on them directly. Another crack, this time behind him. David ran. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the undergrowth, following what he hoped was the path back to his truck. But the forest had changed. The trees seemed closer together, their branches intertwined overhead in patterns that blocked out the sky. The carved symbols appeared everywhere now, burned into trunks, scratched into stones, even formed by the way fallen logs had arranged themselves across the path. He stumbled into a clearing and stopped short. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, each one the height of a man and carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision. At the base of each stone lay a pile of bones, picked clean and arranged with ceremonial precision. Skulls, rib cages, femurs stacked like cordwood. And there, in the center of the circle, was Samantha. She sat with her back against a smaller stone, her hiking clothes torn and stained. Her eyes were open but wrong, rolled back so only the whites showed, and her mouth moved in the same rhythmic chanting David had been following. Blood trickled from the corners of her lips where her teeth had been. "Samantha!" David rushed toward her but stopped when her head turned to track his movement without her eyes focusing on him. The chanting never paused, even as she smiled with her ruined mouth. "She hears the old words now," said a voice behind him. David spun around. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and gaunt, wearing skins that might have once been human. Its face was painted with symbols in what looked like dried blood, and its teeth had been filed to points. But it was the eyes that made David's breath catch. They were human eyes, intelligent and aware, set in a face that had given up its humanity long ago. "She guards the threshold now, as we all do, as you will." More figures emerged from between the stones, all of them painted, all of them watching David with the hungry patience of predators. Some wore the remains of ranger uniforms, others dressed in hiking gear from different decades. All of them had the same filed teeth, the same knowing eyes. "The land remembers," the first figure continued, circling David slowly. "Before your roads, before your maps, before your civilization tried to tame what should not be tamed, we are its memory, we are its voice." David backed toward Samantha, but she stood as he approached, her movements too fluid, too controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that came from something much larger than her throat. "Dad," the word came out wrong, stretched and layered. "It doesn't hurt anymore. Nothing hurts when you stop fighting." The circle of figures closed in, and David realized with crystalline clarity that he was going to die in this place. But worse than that, he wasn't going to stay dead. He was going to become one of them. A guardian of something so old and hungry that it had been feeding on lost travelers since before the first Europeans set foot on this continent. As teeth designed for tearing flesh closed on his throat, David's last coherent thought was that no one would ever find his truck. No one would know what happened to him and Samantha. The forest would keep its secrets, as it always had, adding their names to a list of the disappeared that stretched back centuries. The chanting resumed. Two new voices joining the ancient chorus that echoed through trees older than memory, older than mercy, older than the fragile civilizations that dared to call this wilderness a park. In the ranger station 20 miles away, David's name was added to the missing persons list. Search and rescue would look for him, just as they'd looked for Samantha, just as they'd looked for Torres and all the others. They would find nothing. The forest would make sure of that. But sometimes, on still nights when the fog rolled in heavy between the trees, hikers reported hearing voices carried on the wind. Voices chanting in a language that made their skin crawl and their dogs whimper. Voices that seemed to know their names, calling them deeper into the woods where the old things waited with infinite patience. The land remembers. The land protects itself. And it was always hungry for new guardians. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Tentar novamente o. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas. Michael Thompson adjusted his GPS device for the third time in 10 minutes, though the coordinates hadn't changed. 3 days. That's how long Dr. Sarah Martinez had been missing from the remote research station in Yellowstone's backcountry, and that's how long the Park Service had been giving him bureaucratic runarounds about search protocols. As a forensic analyst with 15 years of experience, Michael had seen enough missing person cases to know the statistics. After 72 hours in wilderness like this, you usually stopped looking for survivors and started looking for remains. But Sarah wasn't just another statistic. She was his former colleague from the Geological Survey, and her research into prehistoric settlement patterns had been groundbreaking. The trail markers ended 2 miles back. Now he was following Sarah's GPS breadcrumbs through terrain that wasn't supposed to exist on any official map. The forest around him felt wrong in ways his analytical mind struggled to categorize. The trees grew in two perfect circles, as if planted rather than naturally occurring. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect hum, nothing except the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of pine needles under his boots. Sarah's last transmission had been precise, clinical. Found the petroglyphs. They're not Native American. Dating suggests pre-Columbian by at least 2,000 years. Going deeper into the site, then nothing. Michael checked his radio again. Static. His satellite phone showed no signal, which shouldn't have been possible this close to the main park roads. Technology had never failed him before. It was the one constant he could rely on when human behavior became unpredictable. The first sign appeared carved into a massive Douglas fir, symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in too many dimensions for his eyes to process. He photographed them with hands that trembled slightly, telling himself it was just the cold. The symbols seemed familiar, though he was certain he'd never seen anything like them in any archaeological database. Sarah's equipment lay scattered in a clearing 50 yards ahead. Her laptop, still running, displayed her research notes. Michael's breath caught as he read the final entry, time-stamped 36 hours ago. The symbols aren't warnings, they're boundaries, and I think I've crossed them. Below that, in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, something's watching, has been watching for hours. Can't see it, but can feel it, like standing too close to a high-voltage line. The air tastes metallic. The trees are moving, but there's no wind. Michael looked up from the screen. The trees around the clearing were perfectly still, but their shadows pointed in directions that defied the position of the sun. His compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. A sound echoed through the forest. Not quite human, not quite animal. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground and into his bones. His radio crackled to life for exactly 3 seconds. Sarah's voice, distant and distorted, speaking words in a language that predated any known human settlement. Michael's rational mind cataloged the impossibilities. The electromagnetic interference, the acoustic properties of the sound, the way his GPS now showed his location as coordinates that placed him simultaneously in Yellowstone and somewhere that didn't exist on any map. Every scientific principle he'd built his career on was breaking down. The second scream came from directly behind him. He spun around to find Sarah standing at the tree line, but wrong. Her skin was the color of old bark, her eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when she opened her mouth to speak, the sounds that emerged belonged to the forest itself. "You shouldn't have come here, Michael." Her voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. Behind her, the trees began to move, their roots emerging from the earth with sounds like breaking bones. The rational part of Michael's mind noted that trees didn't move like that Sarah had been missing for 3 days, that the person standing before him couldn't possibly be his colleague. But the symbols on the trees were glowing now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and Sarah was walking toward him with movements that belonged to something much older than humanity. "The Guardian doesn't like visitors," she said, and Michael realized that whatever was wearing Sarah's face had been using her voice to call him deeper into the forest for the past hour. But it's always hungry. The tree roots burst from the ground around his feet. His radio erupted with sounds that might have been Sarah's real voice, screaming warnings from somewhere else entirely. The compass in his hand shattered, its needle spinning so fast it became a blur before flying apart like shrapnel. Michael ran. Behind him, the thing that looked like Sarah laughed with the sound of wind through dead leaves, and the forest began to follow. Trees uprooted themselves and gave chase, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The symbols burned brighter, and Michael understood with crystal clarity that he had never been meant to leave this place. His analytical mind tried to process what was happening, tried to categorize, to rationalize, to find some scientific explanation for the impossible pursuit closing in behind him. But the forest was older than science, older than logic, older than the human need to understand. And it had been protecting its secrets for much longer than Michael had been trying to solve them. The last thing his rational mind recorded was the realization that the GPS coordinates Sarah had sent, weren't marking her location at all. They were marking his. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Michael's place? 3 days later, park rangers found Michael's equipment scattered in a clearing that showed no signs of recent human presence. His final radio transmission, barely audible through the static, consisted of coordinates that led to a section of forest that didn't appear on any official survey map. The search was called off after 2 weeks. The official report listed both Dr. Sarah Martinez and forensic analyst Michael Thompson as missing, presumed dead due to exposure in hostile terrain. But sometimes, on moonless nights when the wind is still, hikers in that remote section of Yellowstone report hearing voices calling from deep in the forest. 2 voices speaking in perfect harmony, warning travelers to turn back while they still can. The warnings are ignored, they always are, and the forest continues to grow. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Michael adjusted his GPS unit for the 3rd time in 20 minutes. The coordinates unchanged, but somehow feeling wrong. The trail map spread across his dashboard showed Emily Patterson's last known location as a simple red X in Blackwood National Park. But nothing about this search felt simple anymore. 3 days. Emily had been missing for 3 days from what should have been a routine day hike. Michael had coordinated hundreds of search and rescue operations in his 12 years with the Forest Service, and missing hikers followed predictable patterns. They got turned around on familiar trails, followed stream beds in the wrong direction, or took shelter and waited for help. They didn't simply vanish from well-marked paths with no trace. The parking area at Whispering Pines trailhead was empty, except for Emily's blue Honda Civic, still locked with her purse visible on the passenger seat. Michael pulled his field notes from his jacket pocket, reviewing the timeline again. Emily had texted her roommate at 10:47 a.m. saying she was starting the hike. Her phone last pinged the cell tower at 11:23 a.m., then nothing. The trail she'd chosen was a moderate 5-mile loop that should have taken 3 hours maximum. Michael shouldered his pack and started up the trail, following the route Emily would have taken. The morning fog clung to the pine needles, creating shifting curtains of gray that made the familiar forest feel somehow altered. He'd hiked this trail dozens of times, but today the landmark seemed displaced, as if someone had rearranged the landscape while he wasn't looking. At the 2-mile marker, Michael found Emily's first piece of evidence. A granola bar wrapper caught on a thornberry bush, exactly where someone might stop for a snack. He photographed it from multiple angles, then continued deeper into the forest. The logical investigator in him cataloged every detail. Fresh deer tracks in the mud, recent rainfall, no signs of struggle or deviation from the path. But something felt wrong. The wrongness started as a whisper in the back of his mind, so faint he almost dismissed it as fatigue. Michael had been working 18-hour days since Emily's disappearance, coordinating with local law enforcement and organizing volunteer search parties. Stress played tricks on the mind. Yet as he rounded the bend toward Miller's Creek, the whisper grew more insistent. She's still here. Michael stopped walking. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen movement in his peripheral vision, but somehow he knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer alone. His training kicked in, and he scanned the tree line methodically, looking for anything out of place. Dense forest stretched in every direction, punctuated by moss-covered boulders and fallen logs. Nothing moved except the fog. She's watching you. The thought came unbidden, formed in his own mental voice, but carrying a weight that felt foreign. Michael shook his head and checked his radio. "Base, this is Unit 7. I'm at mile marker 2. No sign of the subject yet." Static crackled through the speaker, then cleared. "Copy that, Unit 7. Any findings?" "Found a granola wrapper. Continuing search pattern." Michael clipped the radio back to his belt, but his hands were trembling slightly. When had his hands started trembling? The trail descended toward the creek, where Emily would have stopped to refill her water bottle. Michael had seen her hiking gear inventory. She was experienced, well-prepared, careful. She wouldn't have wandered off the marked path. But as he approached the creek crossing, Michael noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Footprints in the mud. Emily's hiking boots, size 7, the distinctive tread pattern he'd memorized from photographs. But they weren't following the trail. They led directly into the forest, toward a section of old-growth trees so dense that the canopy blocked most of the daylight. Follow them. Michael knelt beside the footprints, taking measurements and photographs. The prints were clear, recent, definitely Emily's. But they led away from the established trail toward terrain that would challenge even experienced hikers. Why would she have gone that way? Because she heard the voice too. Michael straightened so quickly that he stumbled backward. The thought had felt like his own reasoning, his own deductive process, but it carried information he didn't possess. What voice? He pulled out his field notes and reviewed Emily's psychological profile. No history of mental illness, no medications that might cause confusion or disorientation. She was a graduate student in environmental science, rational and methodical in her approach to hiking, like him. The comparison sent an unexpected chill through Michael's chest. He'd always prided himself on his analytical mind, his ability to remain calm and logical under pressure. Missing persons cases were puzzles to be solved through careful observation and systematic investigation. But standing in the filtered light beside Miller's Creek, Michael felt his certainty beginning to crack. She fought it at first, just like you're fighting now. Stop. Michael spoke aloud to the empty forest, his voice sharper than intended. He was talking to himself, which was concerning but not unprecedented during solo operations. Stress manifestation, fatigue-induced audio hallucinations, perfectly explainable phenomena that he'd documented in other search and rescue personnel. But the footprints leading into the dense forest were real. Michael activated his GPS tracker and followed Emily's trail into the trees. The undergrowth was thick here, requiring him to push through tangles of vine maple and salmonberry bushes. The deeper he went, the more the footprints seemed to multiply. Emily's size 7 hiking boots, but now accompanied by other impressions in the soft earth. Bare feet, small hands pressed into the mud. Marks that looked almost like children's handprints except for the length of the fingers. They welcomed her. They'll welcome you too. Michael stopped and forced himself to breathe slowly, methodically. He was experiencing some form of stress reaction, possibly combined with altitude sickness or dehydration. The logical explanation was that he was seeing patterns in random marks left by animals. Bears, deer, maybe raccoons. His mind was interpreting natural forest floor disturbances as something more sinister because of the high-stress situation. But when he looked at his own hands, they were covered in mud he didn't remember touching. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Michael's place? The realization hit him like cold water. Michael stared at his muddy palms, trying to reconstruct the last few minutes. He remembered kneeling beside the creek, photographing Emily's footprints. He remembered pushing through the undergrowth, but he couldn't recall touching the ground with his bare hands, couldn't remember when or why his palms had gotten covered in the dark, rich soil of the forest floor. You're learning to listen. Michael wiped his hands on his pants, leaving dark streaks on the fabric. The mud felt strangely warm, almost body temperature, and it clung to his skin with an oily persistence that soap would struggle to remove. He checked his GPS again. According to the device, he'd traveled nearly a mile into unmarked forest, far beyond where Emily's footprints should have led. But he could see them clearly ahead of him, pressed into the earth like a trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper into the woods. The rational part of Michael's mind, the part that had guided him through 12 years of successful search and rescue operations, began cataloging inconsistencies. GPS devices didn't simply malfunction without warning. Footprints didn't extend beyond the logical range of human travel. Mud didn't maintain body temperature in ambient forest conditions. Logic is just another cage. The voice in his head was becoming clearer, more distinct from his own thoughts. It carried a cadence that felt ancient, patient, like something that had been waiting in these woods for a very long time. Michael pulled out his radio, hands shaking more violently now. "Base, this is Unit 7. I need backup at my current location. Static, then more static. The radio that had worked perfectly an hour ago now produced nothing but white noise. She called for help too, right before she understood. Michael's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. Panic response, he told himself. Textbook stress reaction to equipment failure during a solo operation. But when he tried to remember exactly what he'd understood about Emily's case an hour ago, the details felt slippery, unreliable. Had she been missing for 3 days or 3 weeks? Had she been hiking alone or with someone else? Does it matter? You're here now. You're listening now. The footprints ahead of him were changing. Emily's hiking boots were still visible, but they were being joined by other marks. Long, thin impressions that might have been made by elongated toes. Parallel gouges in the earth that looked disturbingly like claw marks. And everywhere, those small handprints with the impossibly long fingers. Michael knelt beside one of the marks, his analytical mind automatically measuring and photographing, even as another part of his consciousness screamed warnings. The handprint was small, child-sized, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers extended nearly to his wrist when he held his own hand above it for comparison. Children change when they listen long enough. Adults take longer, but they change too. This isn't real. Michael spoke aloud again, hoping that his own voice would anchor him to reality. I'm experiencing some form of psychological break, stress-induced hallucinations combined with possible environmental factors. But his voice sounded different in the thick air beneath the trees. Hollow, as if the forest was absorbing the sound before it could fully form. Emily said the same thing, right up until she joined them. Michael looked up from the handprint and felt his world tilt sideways. Ahead of him, barely visible through the dense undergrowth, stood a figure in hiking gear. Emily's red jacket, Emily's dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, Emily's face turned toward him with an expression of patient invitation. Emily, Michael's voice cracked. Emily Patterson. The figure that looked like Emily smiled, and Michael's stomach lurched. The smile was too wide, stretching beyond the normal boundaries of human facial structure, and her eyes were completely black, as if someone had filled them with the dark mud of the forest floor. She's been waiting for you, Michael. We've all been waiting. Michael stumbled backward, his rational mind finally fragmenting under the weight of impossibility. The figure that looked like Emily began walking toward him, and with each step her proportions seemed to shift slightly. Her arms too long, her fingers extending past where they should have ended, her gait suggesting joints that bent in directions human anatomy didn't permit. You're not Emily. Michael's voice was barely a whisper. I'm all the Emily that matters now. Just like you'll be all the Michael that matters. Other figures began emerging from the trees. Some wore modern hiking gear, others were dressed in clothing from different decades. A few appeared to be children, though their elongated limbs and black eyes suggested something that had never been human at all. They moved with the patient, coordinated purpose of a pack, surrounding Michael in a loose circle that gradually tightened. The forest needs us, Michael. It feeds on us. And in return, we become something more than we ever were alone. Michael's radio crackled to life. Unit 7, this is base. Report your status. He grabbed for the radio with hands that no longer felt entirely under his control. Base, I found Emily. But something's wrong. Something's very wrong. Copy that, Unit 7. What's your current location? Michael looked at his GPS, but the screen now showed only static. When he tried to speak, his own voice came out distorted, carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. Tell them you're fine, Michael. Tell them the search is over. Base, this is Unit 7. The voice coming from his throat was his own, but the words felt foreign, controlled by something else. I'm returning to the trailhead. Search concluded successfully. Understood, Unit 7. Good work. Michael tried to scream, tried to warn them, but his voice box no longer responded to his conscious commands. The thing inside his mind was learning to operate his body, testing the controls like a pilot, familiarizing themselves with a new aircraft. Don't fight it. Emily fought it first, and it only made the transition more painful. The figure wearing Emily's face stepped closer, and Michael could see that her hiking boots had grown roots that disappeared into the forest floor. She was no longer walking on the earth. She was connected to it, part of the vast network of fungal consciousness that had been spreading through these woods for decades. Hikers go missing here because they find us. And once they find us, they never want to leave. Michael felt his own feet beginning to tingle, a warm sensation that started in his toes and spread gradually up his legs. When he looked down, thin white filaments were growing through his boot leather, connecting him to the same network that had claimed Emily. The last rational thought that belonged entirely to Michael was a realization both terrifying and strangely comforting. He would never have to solve another missing persons case, because he finally understood where all the missing persons went. Welcome home, Michael. 3 weeks later, Michael's replacement would find his abandoned search equipment at the Whispering Pines trailhead. The GPS would show his last known location as mile marker 2, near Miller's Creek. The official report would classify both Michael and Emily as missing persons, presumed dead after an extensive search revealed no trace of either individual. But sometimes, on foggy mornings when the light filtered through the trees just right, other hikers would report seeing figures in the forest. People in hiking gear who smiled too widely and beckoned them off the established trails. People whose eyes reflected no light and whose voices carried impossible harmonics that made the listener want to follow them deeper into the woods. The forest was always looking for new voices to add to its choir, and it was very, very patient. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Ryan Kellerman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and stepped over the yellow police tape with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen it all before. 23 years as a federal investigator had taught him that missing persons cases in national parks usually followed predictable patterns. Inexperienced hikers, equipment failure, exposure, sometimes animal attacks. The supernatural explanations that locals whispered about were just rural folklore amplifying natural tragedies. Dr. Kellerman, the young park ranger approached nervously. I'm Ranger Martinez, thank you for coming out here. Ryan barely glanced at him, already scanning the scene with clinical detachment. Where was Megan Lawson last seen? Her campsite was here, but... Martinez hesitated. Sir, there are some things about this case that don't quite... I'm sure there are. Ryan cut him off, kneeling beside the abandoned tent. People panic. Imagination fills gaps. Stories get embellished. I need facts, not folklore. The tent stood perfectly intact. No tears, no signs of struggle. Megan's belongings were arranged with obsessive precision. Sleeping bag folded into exact thirds, cooking gear stacked in perfect geometric patterns, even her boots lined up with military precision. Ryan frowned. The positioning was too deliberate, too ritualistic for someone simply packing up camp. This is how you found everything? Exactly as is. We haven't touched anything. Martinez swallowed hard. But Dr. Kellerman, there's something else. The trees. Ryan looked up impatiently, then froze. Every tree in a perfect 40-foot circle around the campsite had been stripped of its bark from exactly shoulder height down to the ground. The exposed wood underneath was carved with symbols, spiraling patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when he stared at them directly. The cuts were too deep, too clean, as if something had peeled the bark away with superhuman strength. Tool marks? Ryan asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. We thought so initially, but... Martinez pointed to one of the trees. Look closer. Ryan approached the nearest oak and his breath caught. The bark hadn't been cut. It had been torn away in long, precise strips, but there were no tool marks, no blade patterns. Instead, embedded deep in the wood were what looked unmistakably like claw marks. But the spacing was wrong, too wide for any known animal, and the gouges went impossibly deep into the hardwood. Bears don't. No, sir, they don't. Martinez's voice was barely a whisper. And there's more. The ranger led Ryan 20 yards from the campsite to a small clearing where the forest floor was completely bare. No grass, no fallen leaves, no undergrowth. The earth was packed hard as concrete and stained a deep rust color that Ryan's scientific mind didn't want to identify. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made his mouth go dry. 12 saplings had been driven into the ground in a perfect circle, their tops bent inward and woven together to form a dome-like cage. Inside, scattered across the stained earth, were pieces of clothing that Martinez confirmed belonged to Megan. But the clothes weren't torn or scattered randomly. They had been arranged in the same obsessive, ritualistic pattern as her campsite, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This is impossible," Ryan muttered, circling the structure. "The labor involved, the precision. One person couldn't have done this overnight." "Sir," Martinez said quietly, "we've had 3 other disappearances in this area over the past 18 months. Different seasons, different access points, but all involving lone campers. And all the sites—" He gestured helplessly at the cage. "They all had these." Ryan pulled out his digital camera, but as he raised it to photograph the structure, the LCD screen flickered and died. He tried his cell phone, completely dead, though it had been fully charged an hour ago. Even his digital recorder had shut down completely. "Equipment malfunction," he said automatically, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. A sound made them both freeze, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from deep underground. The packed earth beneath their feet vibrated with each beat, and the woven saplings began to sway despite the complete absence of wind. The rust-colored stains on the ground seemed to darken and spread as they watched. "We need to leave," Martinez whispered, backing toward the tree line. "Now." But as they turned to go, Ryan saw something that shattered his worldview completely. The trees surrounding the clearing, massive oaks and pines that would take decades to grow, were moving. Not swaying in wind, but deliberately repositioning themselves, their root systems somehow flowing through the earth like water. The gaps between them were closing, the path they had used to enter narrowing with each passing second. The drumming grew louder, and now it was accompanied by something else. A sound like rushing wind, but underneath it, Ryan could swear he heard voices. Ancient voices speaking in no language he recognized, chanting in harmony with the underground rhythm. "Dr. Kellerman," Martinez grabbed his arm. "The trees are—" Ryan shook him off, his scientific mind still refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. "There has to be an explanation. Subsidence, underground water movement, some kind of seismic activity." A branch crashed down between them, missing Ryan's head by inches. He looked up to see the canopy above writhing like a living thing, branches reaching down with obvious intent. The chanting grew louder, and now he could make out shapes moving in the shadows between the trees. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be part of the forest itself. "Run," Martinez breathed, but when they turned toward what should have been their exit, they found only an impenetrable wall of thorn-covered vines that definitely hadn't been there minutes before. They were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by a forest that was very much alive and very much hostile. The drumming stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Ryan heard footsteps approaching through the undergrowth. Slow, deliberate steps that cracked twigs and displaced stones. But when he looked toward the sound, he saw only shadows moving between trees that continued to shift and close ranks around them. Something was coming. Something that had taken Megan and 3 others. Something that had the power to command the forest itself. And for the first time in his career, Dr. Ryan Kellerman realized that his science had no answers for what was about to emerge from the trees. The footsteps stopped just beyond the tree line, and Ryan could feel something watching them with ancient, patient intelligence. In the distance, carried on wind that touched nothing else, he heard what sounded like Megan's voice calling his name. But Megan had been missing for 3 days. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Ryan's place? Matthew adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and spread the topographical map across the hood of his Jeep Cherokee. 3 days. Sarah Chen had been missing for 3 days from Olympic National Park, and the search patterns weren't adding up. As a senior analyst for the National Park Service's Search and Rescue Coordination, Matthew approached every case like a mathematical equation. variables, probabilities, logical outcomes. The missing hiker's last known position was mile marker 7 on the Ho River Trail. Standard protocol suggested she'd either taken a wrong turn at the junction or suffered an injury within a 2-mile radius. But something felt wrong. The inconsistencies in witness reports, the strange gaps in her digital footprint, the way her camping gear had been found arranged in a perfect circle rather than scattered by wildlife. Matthew started walking the trail, his GPS unit beeping steadily. Sarah's footprints were clear in the mud until mile marker 6.3, where they simply stopped. Not like she'd turned around, not like she'd stepped onto rocks. They just ended, as if she'd been lifted straight up into the canopy. Focus on the evidence, he told himself, photographing the scene. There's always a logical explanation. But as he knelt beside the last footprint, something whispered in his mind. Not heard, but felt. Like fingers tracing across his thoughts, the whisper carried Sarah's voice. "Matthew, help me. It's inside my head." He jerked upright, scanning the forest. "Hello? Sarah?" His voice echoed back, distorted somehow, as if the trees were laughing. Matthew shook his head. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in stressful search operations. He'd documented the phenomenon himself in his quarterly reports, but as he continued down the trail, the whisper returned, stronger this time, and with it came images that weren't his own. Flashes of Sarah running through darkness, something pursuing her that moved like liquid shadow. The GPS signal died at mile marker 58. His satellite phone showed no service. His compass spun wildly before stopping at a direction that didn't exist on any map. Matthew's analytical mind began cataloging rational explanations. Magnetic anomaly, equipment failure, altitude sickness. But another part of him, a part that was growing louder with each step, whispered different words. Words about things that lived in the spaces between thoughts, feeding on logic until nothing remained but screaming madness. By the time he reached the clearing where Sarah's tent should have been, Matthew found himself speaking aloud to voices that answered back in languages he'd never learned but somehow understood. The words crawled out of his mouth like living things, and when he tried to remember his own name, all he could think was, "Sarah, Sarah, join us, Sarah." But his name wasn't Sarah, was it? The thing that wore his thoughts like a coat smiled with his face and kept walking deeper into the woods, where other voices waited, patient and hungry, ready to make room for one more mind in their endless, screaming chorus. Behind him, Matthew's body continued moving, but Matthew, the real Matthew, was already gone, dissolved into the collective that whispered sweet promises of logic and reason, while it slowly, methodically, drove him completely insane. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Matthew's place? The last entry in his field notebook, written in handwriting that wasn't quite his own, read, "Subject successfully integrated. Cognitive patterns harvested. Beginning search for additional specimens. The analyst has become analyzed. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?" David Morrison's hands trembled as he stared at his cell phone, the missed call notification glowing like an accusation. Emily, his 19-year-old daughter, had called him at 3:47 a.m. from somewhere deep within the Cascade Wilderness, and he had been asleep, dead to the world after another 16-hour shift at the lumber mill. The voicemail icon pulsed with an urgency that made his stomach clench. He had always been a light sleeper when Emily was younger, every tiny sound sending him bolt upright in protective father mode. But exhaustion had claimed him completely last night, and now his little girl was missing somewhere in 2 million acres of unforgiving wilderness. Emily had gone on a solo backpacking trip 3 days ago, something he had reluctantly agreed to after months of her pleading. She was an experienced hiker, had been exploring the mountains since she could walk, but the Cascade Wilderness was different, older, more hostile than the familiar trails around their hometown. David's finger hovered over the voicemail as dawn light filtered through the kitchen window of his small house in Cle Elum, Washington. He had built this place with his own hands after the divorce, needing something that was entirely his and Emily's. The kitchen table where he sat was scarred from years of homework sessions, craft projects, and late-night talks about everything and nothing. Emily's hiking boots still sat by the back door, the backup pair she had decided not to take. The sight of them made his chest tight. The phone rang suddenly in his hand, causing him to nearly drop it. Unknown number. Hello? His voice came out rough, unpracticed. Mr. Morrison? This is Ranger Patricia Voss with the Cascade Wilderness Station. I understand your daughter Emily is overdue from a backpacking trip. David's throat constricted. He had filed the missing persons report yesterday when Emily failed to return as scheduled, but hearing it from an official made it horrifyingly real. Yes, she was supposed to be back Tuesday. It's Thursday now. I have her permit information here. She was planning to hike the Glacier Peak Loop, correct? That's a challenging trail, but your daughter's wilderness experience is impressive. Has she ever been late returning before? Never. The word came out sharper than he intended. Emily was meticulous about plans, almost obsessively so. She would call if she was going to be even an hour late from anything. She left a detailed itinerary. She was supposed to call me every evening by satellite phone to check in. And the last time you heard from her was? David looked down at his phone again, that voicemail waiting like a loaded gun. Monday night. She called around 9, said she was making good time, weather was perfect, everything was normal. There was a pause on the other end. Mr. Morrison, I need to ask, did you try calling her back after she didn't check in Tuesday? Of course I did. Her satellite phone goes straight to voicemail now. I've been calling every few hours. He hesitated, then added, she called again early this morning. I missed it. There's a voicemail I haven't listened to yet. I think you should listen to that message, Mr. Morrison. We're organizing a search and rescue operation, but any information about her current condition or location could be vital. David nodded, though she couldn't see him. I'll call you back. After hanging up, he sat staring at the phone for several minutes. The rational part of his mind knew that Emily was probably fine, injured maybe, or her equipment had malfunctioned, or she had simply gotten turned around. The Cascade Wilderness was vast and unforgiving, but Emily knew how to survive. He had made sure of that. But a deeper part of him, some ancient paternal instinct, whispered that something was terribly wrong. He pressed play on the voicemail. Emily's voice came through the speaker, but it was wrong from the first syllable. Gone was his daughter's usual confidence, her easy humor. This voice was stretched thin with terror, breaking apart like old fabric. Daddy? The word was barely a whisper, punctuated by ragged breathing. Daddy, something's wrong. I can't. Static crackled, and when her voice returned, it was higher, more panicked. It's in my head, Dad. It's been in my head for hours and I can't get it out. I can hear it thinking, and it's not human thoughts. David's blood turned to ice water. The things it shows me, Dad. The things it wants me to do. I'm trying to fight it, but it's so strong, and it knows things about me that no one should know. It knows about Mom leaving. It knows about your drinking after the divorce. It knows about the scar on my knee from when I was 7 and how I got it. And I never told anyone that story, Dad, not even you. The static grew louder, almost drowning out her words. I'm near Devil's Backbone Ridge, I think. I can see the old fire tower. But the trail isn't where it should be. Nothing is where it should be. The trees are moving when I'm not looking at them. They're closer every time I turn around. Emily's breathing became more labored, interspersed with small, broken sobs. Dad, I don't think I'm alone out here. There are other voices now, not just the one in my head. They're calling my name from the forest, but it's not. They don't sound right. One of them sounds like you, but it's wrong. It knows things you would never say. A long pause filled with nothing but static and the sound of wind through trees. I love you, Daddy. I'm going to try to get back to the main trail, but if I don't make it, if something happens to me, don't come looking. Please don't come looking. Whatever's out here, it wants more than just me. I can feel it hungry for family. It wants us both. The message cut off abruptly. David stared at the phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He played the message again, then again, each time catching new details that made his skin crawl. Emily's voice carried a quality he had never heard before. Not just fear, but a kind of violated horror, as if something had reached inside her mind and rearranged everything it found there. Devil's Backbone Ridge. He knew it well, had hiked there countless times in his younger days. It was a remote area in the heart of the wilderness, accessible only by a grueling 2-day hike from the nearest trailhead. If Emily was there, if she was hurt or lost, or worse, then every minute counted. He called Ranger Voss back immediately. "I listened to the message," he said without preamble. "She's at Devil's Backbone Ridge. Something's wrong with her, really wrong. She's talking about voices, about something in her head." "Mr. Morrison, people under extreme stress in wilderness situations can experience hallucinations, paranoia, even temporary psychosis. Dehydration, hypothermia, altitude sickness. This isn't hypothermia." His voice was sharp enough to cut. "I know my daughter. She's experienced, she's prepared, and she doesn't panic. Something is out there with her." A pause. "We'll include Devil's Backbone Ridge in our search grid. I have to warn you, though, that's some of the most difficult terrain in the wilderness. Our teams won't be able to reach that area until tomorrow at the earliest, and only if weather conditions permit." Tomorrow? David was already moving toward his bedroom, pulling gear from his closet. She could be dead by tomorrow. "Mr. Morrison, I cannot stress this enough. Do not attempt to go in there alone. The terrain is extremely dangerous, the weather is deteriorating, and you don't have wilderness training. You'll only endanger yourself and divert resources from the official search." But David was no longer listening. He was looking at the framed photograph on his nightstand. Emily at 17, grinning triumphantly from the summit of Mount Rainier, her first major peak. They had climbed it together, just the two of them, celebrating her high school graduation. She had been so proud, so alive, so fearless. He would not let her die alone in those mountains. "Thank you for your help, Ranger Voss. I'll be in touch." He hung up before she could protest further. David had grown up in these mountains, had spent his childhood summers working for the Forest Service with his father. He knew the Cascade Wilderness as well as anyone alive, knew the unmarked trails and forgotten routes that didn't appear on any map. More importantly, he knew how to move fast and light through difficult terrain. The official search and rescue team would be methodical, careful, slow. They would follow protocols and safety procedures, and probably find Emily's body in a week. He would find her today. The drive to the Glacier Peak trailhead took 2 hours on winding mountain roads, David pushing his truck harder than was wise on the rain-slicked asphalt. The weather was deteriorating exactly as Ranger Voss had warned. Low-hanging clouds pregnant with snow, visibility dropping with each mile of elevation gained. October in the Cascades was unpredictable at best, deadly at worst. He parked at the empty trailhead and shouldered his pack, heavy with emergency medical supplies, extra food, and survival gear. The trail stretched ahead of him into a gray wall of mist and forest, ancient Douglas firs disappearing into low clouds like massive cathedral pillars supporting an invisible ceiling. David had hiked this trail dozens of times, but never under these conditions, never with this crushing weight of paternal terror driving him forward. Every step took him deeper into a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile, increasingly wrong. The first few miles passed in a blur of switchbacks and steady climbing. David maintained a punishing pace, driven by the memory of Emily's voice, the broken quality of her words. Whatever had happened to her, whatever was happening to her right now, it was beyond anything in his experience as a father or as a man who thought he understood the natural world. As he climbed higher, the familiar landmarks began to feel subtly off. The trail markers were where they should be, but the distances between them seemed longer than he remembered. The forest itself appeared denser, darker, as if the trees had crept closer to the path when no one was watching. By mid-afternoon, he had covered ground that should have taken him well into evening. Impossible, but his GPS confirmed it. He was making time that defied logic, as if the mountain itself was pulling him forward, eager to deliver him to whatever waited at Devil's Backbone Ridge. The wrongness intensified as daylight began to fade. Sounds carried strangely through the mist, his own footsteps echoing back with too much clarity. Bird calls that started and stopped with mechanical precision. The rustle of branches when there was no wind. Several times he caught movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that didn't correspond to any visible objects. When he stopped to check his map and GPS, the devices showed conflicting information. According to the GPS, he was still miles from Devil's Backbone Ridge. According to the topographical map, the ridge should be visible just ahead through the thinning trees. According to his own experience and dead reckoning, he was somewhere that existed on neither. David stood at a trail junction that shouldn't exist, staring at two paths that branched in directions his map didn't show. The left path dropped down into a valley filled with fog so thick it looked solid. The right path climbed steeply toward what might have been Devil's Backbone Ridge, or might have been something else entirely. He pulled out his phone to call for help, but there was no signal. There should have been at least minimal coverage at this elevation, enough for emergency calls. Instead, his phone showed no bars and a battery indicator that couldn't be right. It read 43%, though he had started with a full charge only hours ago. As he stood there, trying to reconcile the impossible geography with what he knew to be true, a sound drifted down from the right-hand path. A voice, distant but clear, calling his name. David. He froze. The voice was Emily's, but wrong in the same way her voicemail had been wrong. Too hollow, too perfectly articulated, as if something was carefully reproducing human speech without quite understanding how it should sound. David, I'm up here. I need help. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to retreat to the main trail and wait for professional search teams. But it was Emily's voice, distorted or not, and she was his daughter. He had failed her by sleeping through her call for help. He would not fail her again. David took the right-hand path. The trail climbed through increasingly twisted terrain, switchbacking up slopes that seemed far steeper than anything he remembered from previous visits to this area. The fog grew thicker rather than thinner as he gained elevation, reducing visibility to mere yards. The trees pressed closer to the trail, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of green-black shadows. David, the voice came again, closer now but somehow more distant, as if Emily were calling to him from the bottom of a deep well. He quickened his pace, slipping occasionally on rocks made treacherous by moisture and decay. Something was following him. The realization crept into his consciousness gradually, an accumulation of small wrongnesses that finally cohered into certainty, footsteps that matched his own rhythm but came from slightly behind and to the left, breathing that wasn't quite synchronized with his own, the sense of being observed by something that understood the importance of remaining hidden. David stopped abruptly and turned around. The trail behind him was empty, disappearing into fog after a few yards. But the sense of presence remained stronger now, as if his watcher had moved closer during the moment of direct attention. Hello? His voice sounded thin and fragile in the dense air. Emily, are you there? No response except the whisper of wind through needles and the distant drip of condensation from invisible branches. He continued climbing, but now every step felt like a violation, an intrusion into territory that belonged to something else. The very air seemed to resist his passage, growing thicker and harder to breathe despite the elevation. His headlamp, though it should have been unnecessary in daylight, barely penetrated the unnatural darkness that gathered between the trees. When David finally emerged onto what had to be Devil's Backbone Ridge, the sight that greeted him made no sense. The ridge was there, recognizable from his previous visits, but everything else was wrong. The fire tower Emily had mentioned in her voicemail stood where it should, but it was intact, newly painted, showing no signs of the decades of weather damage he remembered. The surrounding peaks rose into a sky that was simultaneously day and night. Gray clouds shot through with unnatural auroras of green and purple light. And there, sitting on a fallen log near the base of the fire tower, was Emily. She looked up as he approached and smiled with an expression of perfect contentment that made his blood freeze. This was his daughter's face, his daughter's body. but the thing looking out through her eyes was something else entirely. "Hi, Daddy," she said, her voice carrying the same hollow quality he had heard on the voicemail. "I've been waiting for you." David's legs nearly gave out beneath him. Emily appeared unharmed, healthy even, her hiking clothes clean and dry despite days in the wilderness. But her eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, as if someone had carved out everything behind them and filled the space with dark water. "Emily?" He approached slowly, every instinct screaming warnings he didn't understand. "Sweetheart, are you okay? I got your message. You sounded terrified." "Did I?" She tilted her head with bird-like curiosity. "I don't remember being terrified. I remember being opened, expanded. Do you know what it's like to think with more than one mind, Daddy? To know things you never learned? To remember experiences that aren't yours?" David stopped 6 feet away from her, close enough to see that her pupils were dilated to nearly fill her irises, close enough to notice that she wasn't blinking. "Emily, you called me. You said something was in your head, that you were hearing voices." "Oh, I am hearing voices." Her smile widened beyond what human facial muscles should allow. "I'm hearing your voice, Daddy. Your thoughts, your fears, your guilt about Mom leaving, about how you used to wish Emily would just grow up and move away so you could drink yourself to death in peace." The words hit him like physical blows. Those thoughts, those dark moments of despair in the months after the divorce, he had never spoken them aloud, had barely acknowledged them to himself. "That's not... How do you know about that?" "Because I know everything about you now. Every shameful thought, every failure, every moment of weakness. And soon you'll know everything about me too. About us. About the family you're going to join." Emily stood up with movements that were too fluid, too controlled, like a marionette operated by an expert puppeteer. As she moved, David caught glimpses of something else in her shadow. Something that didn't match her outline. Something with too many limbs and angles that hurt to look at directly. "The others are excited to meet you," she continued, taking a step toward him. "There are so many of us now, all the hikers and campers and searchers who came looking for their loved ones over the years. We're all family here, Daddy. One big, happy family sharing the same beautiful mind." David backed away, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt. But this was still Emily, still his daughter, whatever had been done to her. "We can fix you," he said desperately. "Get you to a hospital, find doctors who can help with whatever this is. Parasites, drugs, some kind of psychological break." "Psychological break?" Emily laughed, and the sound echoed from multiple throats, multiple voices layered over each other in a cacophony of mirth. "Oh, Daddy, you still don't understand. There's nothing broken here, there's nothing to fix, there's only evolution." She reached toward him with one hand, and David saw that her fingernails had grown long and black, more like claws than anything human. "Just let me touch you, Daddy. Let me share what I've learned. It only hurts for a moment and then everything becomes so much clearer." David stumbled backward, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Emily was sick, hallucinating, maybe drugged by someone. There had to be a rational explanation. But even as he tried to cling to logic, he could feel something probing at the edges of his consciousness. A foreign presence testing the boundaries of his mind like fingers trailing along a locked door, looking for weaknesses, for cracks it could exploit. "Stay away from me," he gasped, drawing his knife. "Emily, if you're still in there, fight this thing. Fight it." "I am fighting, Daddy." Her voice was layered now, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "I'm fighting to make you understand. We don't want to hurt you. We want to complete you." The presence in his mind pressed harder, and suddenly David was overwhelmed by images that weren't his own. Emily's memories, but wrong, corrupted. He saw her camping alone on the first night, setting up her tent in a clearing that seemed perfectly normal. He saw her waking in darkness to find her tent surrounded by figures that might have been other campers, if other campers stood 8 feet tall and had too many joints in their arms. He saw the moment when the thing that looked like a lost hiker approached her fire, asking for help. Speaking with the voice of her college roommate Sarah, who had died in a car accident 2 years ago, he felt Emily's confusion, her growing terror as she realized that this thing knew intimate details about Sarah's life, about their friendship, about conversations they had shared that no one else could have overheard. He experienced the moment when the creature touched her forehead with fingers like icicles, and the sensation of his own consciousness being pushed aside as something vast and hungry and impossibly old took up residence in his mind. But these weren't just Emily's memories. As the images flooded through him, David began to see other perspectives, other victims. Hikers who had disappeared over the years, their final moments preserved in the collective consciousness of whatever was infecting his daughter. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all drawn into the wilderness by false distress calls from loved ones, all subsumed into a hive mind that grew stronger with each addition. "Do you see now?" Emily asked, her voice impossibly gentle. "Do you understand what we're offering you? You'll never be alone again, Daddy. Never afraid again, never uncertain. We're all here together, all of us who love you." David's vision blurred as the foreign presence pressed deeper into his consciousness. He could feel his own thoughts being examined, catalogued, absorbed. His love for Emily, his guilt over the divorce, his fear of growing old alone. All of it was being scrutinized by something that had no right to exist in his mind. But in the midst of the invasion, he caught a glimpse of something else. A small flickering spark of genuine Emily, trapped somewhere deep within the layered consciousness that had consumed her. She was still there, still fighting, still trying to warn him even as the thing wearing her face tried to seduce him into joining their collective nightmare. That spark of his real daughter gave him the strength to resist. David lunged forward, not at Emily, but past her, toward the fire tower. If this was some kind of shared hallucination, some form of mass hysteria or psychological contagion, maybe getting to higher ground would help him think more clearly. Maybe he could find a way to call for help, to break free of whatever influence was affecting his perception. "Daddy, don't." Emily's voice carried genuine distress for the first time since he had found her. "You don't understand what you're doing." He reached the base of the fire tower and began climbing the metal stairs that spiraled around its exterior. Each step took him higher above the fog, above the oppressive wrongness that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. The presence in his mind fought his ascent, flooding him with vertigo and phantom pain, but he pushed through it. Halfway up the tower, David made the mistake of looking down. The clearing below was no longer empty except for Emily. Figures emerged from the tree line, dozens of them, all wearing the faces of missing hikers and campers. He recognized some of them from news reports over the years, people who had vanished without a trace in the Cascade wilderness. They moved with the same too fluid grace as Emily, their shadows writhing with shapes that didn't match their human silhouettes. And they were all looking up at him with expressions of patient hunger. "Come down, Daddy," Emily called, her voice now joined by a chorus of others. "Come down and join your family." David reached the top of the fire tower and found himself in the observer's cabin, a small enclosed space with windows on all sides. The view from here should have shown him the familiar peaks and valleys of the Cascade wilderness, but instead, he looked out on a landscape that defied geography. Mountains folded in on themselves like origami, valleys spiraled down into infinite darkness, and the sky writhed with aurora that spelled out messages in languages that predated human speech. The radio equipment in the cabin was old but functional, probably left behind by the last fire spotter to work this tower decades ago. David fumbled with the controls, trying to raise anyone, trying to call for help. "Mayday, Mayday. This is David Morrison at Devil's Backbone Ridge Fire Tower. I need immediate assistance. My daughter is missing and there's something wrong here, something impossible." Static answered him, but within the white noise he could hear voices. Familiar voices. His ex-wife Linda, speaking in the tone she used when she was trying to be patient with his failures. His father, dead for 15 years, offering advice about raising daughters. Emily herself, but younger, the voice she'd had as a child, when she still thought her daddy could fix anything. "David," they said in unison, "why are you fighting this? Why are you trying to leave us? We love you. We want to be with you forever." He smashed the radio with his fist, and the voices stopped. Below, the crowd of infected campers had begun to climb the tower. They moved with inhuman coordination, some scaling the exterior structure like spiders, others flowing up the stairs in a synchronized rhythm that made David's eyes water to watch. He was trapped. David looked around the cabin desperately, searching for anything that could serve as a weapon or a way out. The windows were too small to climb through, and the drop to the ground would certainly be fatal. But in one corner, he found something that made his heart race with desperate hope. A flare gun. He didn't know if fire would affect these things, didn't know if they could be hurt or killed or driven off by anything in the normal world. But he was about to find out. The first of the climbers reached the cabin windows just as David loaded the flare gun. Through the glass, he saw a face he recognized from a news report 3 years ago, a college student who had vanished while hiking with friends. The student smiled at him with Emily's too-wide grin and began to push his fingers through the glass, the panes bending like water around his touch. David fired the flare directly into the creature's face. The result was immediate and horrifying. The thing that had been wearing the college student's appearance began to burn, but not with normal fire. Purple flames consumed its flesh, revealing something underneath that was all angles and shadows and hungry mouths. It screamed with a sound like breaking glass and fell away from the window. The other climbers paused in their ascent, and David heard Emily's voice from below, no longer patient, no longer loving. "Fine," she snarled, and now there was nothing human in her tone at all. "If you won't join us willingly, we'll take you apart piece by piece and rebuild you the way we want." The tower began to shake. David looked out the windows and saw that the creatures below had surrounded the tower's base and were working in concert to topple it. The massive structure groaned and swayed, metal joints shrieking in protest. He had maybe minutes before the whole thing came down. Think, he told himself. Think, like Emily would think. She was the smart one, the one who could solve problems under pressure. What would she do? The answer came to him with sudden clarity. Emily had mentioned the old fire tower in her voicemail, but she had also said the trail wasn't where it should be, that nothing was where it should be. If this whole experience was some kind of shared hallucination or psychic manipulation, then maybe the rules of physical reality were more flexible than they appeared. Maybe he didn't have to play by the rules these things expected. David closed his eyes and focused on his memory of the real Devil's Backbone Ridge, the one he had visited countless times over the years. He pictured the actual trail, the real fire tower, the genuine geography of this place as it existed in the waking world. He held that image in his mind with desperate intensity, using his love for Emily and his knowledge of these mountains as anchors to reality. When he opened his eyes, the tower had stopped shaking. The creatures below were still there, still trying to topple the structure, but their efforts were becoming less coordinated, less effective. Whatever reality distortion they were using to create this nightmare landscape was beginning to falter under the weight of David's certainty about what was real. But the effort was costing him. He could feel the presence in his mind fighting back, trying to overwhelm his sense of reality with its own twisted version of truth. Images flooded his consciousness. Emily's death, Linda leaving him, his father's disappointment, every failure and fear and moment of weakness he had ever experienced. "You're weak," the presence whispered in his mind. "You're alone. You've always been alone. Let us fix that. Let us make you part of something greater." David gritted his teeth and held on to the image of the real world, but he could feel his grip slipping. The presence was too strong, too vast, and he was just one tired, desperate father fighting against something that had consumed dozens of minds over the years. Then he heard Emily's voice, but different this time. Clearer. Younger. "Daddy, remember the story?" He almost lost his concentration. This was Emily's voice as she had been when she was 8 years old, on the night when thunderstorms had kept her awake and afraid. She had climbed into his bed and asked him to tell her a story that would keep the monsters away. Remember the story about the brave princess and the dragon that lived in people's heads? David's eyes snapped open. He remembered that story, one he had improvised on the spot to help Emily deal with her nightmares. A fairy tale about a princess who discovered that an evil dragon was making people think terrible thoughts. and how she had defeated it by refusing to believe its lies. It was just a children's story, something he had made up to help his daughter sleep. But Emily was reminding him of it now. The real Emily, still fighting somewhere inside the collective consciousness that had consumed her. She was telling him how to save her. David stood up in the fire tower cabin and spoke aloud, his voice carrying across the impossible landscape below. "I don't believe you," he said simply. "None of this is real. You're a parasite, a disease, and you have no power except what we give you." The creatures below froze in their assault on the tower. "I know my daughter," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "I know these mountains. I know what's real and what isn't, and you are not real. You're just a collection of fears and lies and stolen thoughts, and I reject you." The landscape around him began to shift and waver, like a mirage losing cohesion under scrutiny. The impossible mountains folded back into their proper configurations. The writhing sky settled into normal gray clouds, and the aurora letters faded into nothing. "You're stronger than I expected," the thing wearing Emily's face called up to him, but its voice was becoming distorted, less human with each word. "But we have your daughter. If you won't join us, she'll remain trapped with us forever." "No," David said. And now he was climbing down from the tower, no longer afraid of the creatures that surrounded its base. As he descended, they became less solid, more transparent, until he could see through them to the real forest beyond. "Emily's not trapped. She's been fighting you this whole time, keeping enough of herself free to call for help, to guide me here, to remind me of what matters." He reached the ground and walked directly toward the thing that looked like his daughter. Up close, he could see that its face was flickering between Emily's features and something else, something that was all hunger and void and ancient malevolence. "Emily," he said gently, "it's time to come home." The creature snarled and lunged at him with claws extended, but David didn't flinch. He reached out and touched its face with his bare hand, skin to skin, and spoke the words that had ended his daughter's nightmares 20 years ago. "The dragon lives in lies, but love is always true." The creature screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and its stolen face began to dissolve. Behind it, David saw Emily, the real Emily, falling unconscious but breathing, her features peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Around them, the other figures faded like morning mist, and the clearing returned to its normal proportions. The fire tower was there, but old and weathered as it should be, showing decades of neglect. The mountains were the right shape, the sky was the right color, and David was standing in the place he had known since childhood. Emily stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, she looked confused, disoriented. Then she focused on his face and began to cry. "Dad? Is it really you?" I couldn't tell what was real anymore. There were so many voices, so many thoughts that weren't mine. "It's me, sweetheart. It's over now." David carried his daughter down from Devil's Backbone Ridge, following the real trail back toward civilization. It took them 2 days of careful hiking, Emily weak and traumatized, but recovering her strength with each mile they put between themselves and that cursed clearing. On the second night, as they camped beside a familiar stream, Emily asked the question he had been dreading. "What was it, Dad? What happened to me up there?" David looked into the campfire, watching the flames dance in patterns that seemed almost linguistic, almost meaningful. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Something old. Something that feeds on isolation and fear and the love that makes us vulnerable to each other. Something that shouldn't exist, but does anyway." Emily nodded, accepting the inadequacy of the explanation. Some experiences they both understood now existed beyond the reach of rational explanation. "Will it come back?" she asked. David considered lying, offering false comfort, but Emily deserved better than that. "I don't know," he said again, "but if it does, we'll face it together." They hiked out the next morning, emerging from the wilderness to find a massive search and rescue operation in progress. Ranger Voss was there, along with dozens of volunteers and professional search teams. David had expected lectures about his reckless decision to enter the wilderness alone, but one look at Emily's condition silenced any criticism. Later, at the hospital where Emily was being observed for dehydration and exhaustion, a doctor asked David about the scratches on her arms, thin parallel lines that looked almost like writing in a language no one recognized. "I don't know," David said for the third time in as many days, and meant it. The scratches faded within a week, but Emily's dreams took longer to clear. For months afterward, she would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she could hear voices calling her name from the darkness outside her window. David would sit with her until dawn, both of them listening to the normal sounds of wind and rain and the distant highway, reminding themselves that they were safe, that they were home, that they were real. Emily never went backpacking alone again. She tried it once, 6 months later, but turned back after a single night in the forest. Some part of her, she said, would always be listening for voices that sounded like family, but spoke with the hunger of something that had never been human. David understood. Some part of him would always be standing in that impossible clearing, facing the choice between surrender and love, between the false peace of absorption and the difficult reality of being genuinely, separately, vulnerably human. He had chosen love, chosen reality, chosen the hard truth of being alone in his own mind. It was the right choice. But on quiet nights when the wind moved through the trees around his house in patterns that seemed almost intentional, almost meaningful, David sometimes wondered if something was still out there in the wilderness, patient and hungry, waiting for the next lost hiker to answer its call. He hoped he was wrong, but he didn't believe he was. Tentar novamente.